On today's episode of This Week in Space, we'll be chatting you up about the massive flood of friendly emails we've received. We'll address questions, comments, and even some observations of what we can do to further please you, our valued listeners. Stay with us.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is This Week in Space, episode number 17, recorded June 24th, 2022. Incoming comms, your emails. Hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in Space, the fan feedback edition. Yes, we've dug into the virtual mailbag and the interwebs to dredge up the good, the bad, and the ugly from our fan mail. Honestly, and I'm not preening here, the message has been great so far, and it's been delightful to hear from you, so thank you very much for sending them in. And today we're going to talk about them. I'm Rod Pyle, editor-in-chief of Ad Astra Magazine, and I'm joined, as always, by the one, the only, the great Tariq Malik, editor-in-chief, over at space.com.
Yeah, the chief part is really important, Rod. You don't want to forget that part.
Sorry. Well, I mean, you were managing editor, you're executive editor. It's hard to keep track of your greatness, but yeah, editor-in-chief is good.
I would point out it's not hard for me to keep track of my greatness, and my wife might to her chagrin, have to admit that I do think very highly of myself. So, is that the crickets? Am I getting that too?
Well, my family keeps me on the straight and narrow of humility, but maybe we'll trade at some point. All right.
I get crickets at home too, Aunt, so it's all right.
Allow me to send you rolling in the aisles. Are you ready?
Oh, I'm so ready.
Hey, Tariq, why haven't aliens come to our solar system yet?
Why haven't aliens come to our solar system yet?
They read the reviews, and we only got 1 star. That was actually not too bad.
That's an actual astronomy joke there.
But wait, as the Ginsu salesman said, there's more. Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Solar.
Solar who?
Solar, you going to think of a better joke? Okay. Yeah, even I could smell that one a mile away.
That one needs the crickets. Yes. So
okay.
Ant was on it. He was ready. He was ready for that one.
Okay. Let's get down to it and stop wasting so much time. So before we crawl into the mailbag, though, let's get through some space headlines, courtesy, as always, of the great space.com. Let's call this one, Who Was That Masked Man? So the SLS wet rehearsal redo has wrapped, albeit with a few issues. And I'm going to let you go into some more detail, Tariq. But the last real news I looked at, I know it's been cleared now, was that they had a couple of problems at the terminal phase of the count. And the last one I saw, they stopped at T-minus 29 instead of T-minus 10 where they planned because of another hydrogen leak. So to continue the count, they did something I'd never heard of before called masking. So normally what would be a red flag event was masked, meaning that they basically just tell the software to ignore it so they can continue, and they'll deal with it later, which actually makes sense when it's something as basic as a hydrogen leak. I think it was an umbilical cable on the bottom of the core stage. And hydrogen molecules are really small, so they leak easily. So it's something that'll have to be looked at. They've dealt with this many times before. But as your trusted reporter, Mike Wall, said, quote, the most recent Artemis I wet dress rehearsal wasn't perfect, but it was good enough to keep the NASA moon mission on course for liftoff a few months from now, unquote. You agree?
Well, I mean, I have thoughts, right? And NASA actually, just before we started recording this episode, NASA had a press conference that was reiterating that they've declared this, I guess it's the 4th wet dress rehearsal, the 4th fueling attempt. They've declared it a success, but I always think it's kind of weird that they're going to say, well, we've got this leak, we're just going to ignore it and act as if it's not happening and then just keep going. And because they wouldn't be able to do that in an actual launch. And they did say that in this briefing that, hey, there's these things, we masked them because we wanted to get through and test. We're pretty confident we can fix that leak in the future. And And so they've got this kind of checklist of 10 major things, like verifying the interfaces between Orion, the capsule on the rocket, and ground systems, or the systems between the mega rocket, the Space Launch System, and its systems, and how they all talk to each other. And they've got all these fun check marks, and the only thing that's left is testing and installing the flight termination system, which you don't want to have that, right? Go wrong.
No, that could be
before
a bad
you ever try.
if you push the wrong button. Whoops.
So it's kind of 80% there, 20% not. But they're going to call it a win right now. They did say that there's a lot of stuff they have to fix. I mean, they started their fueling test for this one. They started 2 hours late, and the test director said in this briefing that, hey, if they get to an actual launch day and they have those kinds of delays, if you start 2 hours late, you've already missed your launch window to the moon for the month. With the way that this system for Artemis I is set up, because it is based on the moon's kind of schedule, its orbit, where it is, and so they've got like a few days every now and then when they can try, and so there are big problems that they still need to address in the future. But the kind of core things: how do you fuel the rocket? Can you do the countdown in a controlled environment? Can you fix that leak in real time if you need to? They're confident that if it happened in an actual countdown, that they could actually either send some folks out there or do a workaround to stop that leak in the future. So they say that it's great. I mean, I would prefer to see I guess when it comes to spaceflight, I do expect things to go perfectly, because I always worry that if they don't, it's a bad day for everybody. And so I would have hoped to seen, especially on the fourth fueling test, a much cleaner and much more open shut case for the rehearsal. But it is a new vehicle. We've talked about that many times in the 3 months that they've been doing this test since March, right. and so I think we're gonna just kind of see how it goes. What I didn't hear in the analysis today of this test is what the next plans are, because as June ends, NASA will be returning the rocket to the vehicle assembly building, taking it off the pad, and they're expecting something like a 4-week turnaround to come back to the pad for the actual launch. They're targeting the end of August, so I'm not sure if we had that in our bingo cards, Rod. They said that this week that they're looking for late August. So
I think actually what that means is we both lost the bet.
Yeah, and knock on wood, it doesn't get into Labor Day, right? Because it could easily slip. Because as we mentioned a while ago, they did release launch dates through mid-June of 2023 for this one mission.
Right.
But what they said is, they don't think that they need to do another fueling test. I had expected some kind of static fire on the launch pad of the actual engines. I'm not sure if they're going to do that now, and that's what I want to hear.
Because that's a green run, isn't it?
Well, I mean, the original green run plan was to do all of that on the pad too. Like they might have pulled it out when they did that test back at Stennis, right? When they were setting everything up. So I think that we'll have to wait and see, because there's still a bunch of open questions that I would like to know get resolved. So, I'm hopeful. It seems like they got all the test objectives they wanted to get done, but not as clean cut as maybe they would have preferred.
Well, and I haven't seen much engineering detail released yet, and I'm not sure I'd understand all of what they did. But if it's a hydrogen leak, and at least I think it was Space News said it was the only place I saw that mentioned that it was an umbilical on the core stage, that could just be a faulty O-ring in a coupler or something. So hopefully that's a small fix. Okay, moving along.
Yeah, they're going to replace what NASA said actually just before we recorded. They said that they're going to replace a seal on this quick disconnect on the tail service mast umbilical, which will address this leak that they picked up. And now there was some other stuff. They did talk about some issues with the Orion spacecraft too, which they're going to be looking into. It doesn't sound like it was serious, but it was like a hiccup in either the telemetry or the preparations for the vehicle itself on the rocket, and something they didn't see in the earlier test. So they're going to be looking at that too. But it did not sound, when they were discussing it today, like it was a really big issue. It was just kind of like a change of processes for testing.
All right, you prime aerospace contractors, get busy and fix that sucker. Next up, it's a junker. So new space company Astroscale recently announced plans for a mission in conjunction with OneWeb, which is another orbital broadband company like Starlink, to launch a space junk cleanup mission in 2024. The Japanese company flew a preliminary mission to test their debris capturing technology just last month. The intent of the 2024 mission will be to test satellite rendezvous, capture, and deorbit technology, and Astroscale hopes to make debris removal routine by 2030. And as we've discussed before on this podcast, orbital debris is a big problem. Figuring out how to get rid of it or repurpose it is critical stuff. And I think what Astroscale is doing is, if I recall correctly, mostly aimed at either deorbiting stuff or moving it into an orbit that's harmless.
Yeah, this is interesting because Astroscale actually is coming off a recent test that was much like this fueling run. It wasn't the really clear-cut demonstration they had hoped. They actually had some anomalies with the spacecraft where they had started to do their avoidance tests, and it kind of failed. They lost contact with the vehicle for a bit. They had to postpone it. They were able to restore that access, and they were able to complete it. So I guess the data they got from that test was very satisfactory, and enough so that OneWeb, which is building a mega constellation of internet satellites, does want to kind of test this rendezvous in deorbit. And that's really key for OneWeb because they want to have a massive fleet of hundreds and hundreds of satellites, much like SpaceX, and having a way to safely address debris concerns for a massive constellation like that is important if you're talking about keeping space clean for not just your constellation, but for every other satellite and spacecraft that's out there. So they seem now to kind of be at the front of the space debris cleanup push, because there are many other companies that have been testing ways to clean up debris. And now Astroscale has this kind of this debris removal, this space garbage truck plan in place to do this in the next couple of years, which is pretty exciting.
Well, and it used to be, the wonks that talked about employment would tell young people, go into nursing or go into medical because you'll always have a job. But man, if you go into orbital debris cleanup, you will have job security for a long, long time.
Yeah, I mean, and this is Astroscale is a fairly benign. They're talking about rendezvousing up nice and close, either attaching and then increasing drag, or doing some fairly low impact types of rendezvous. But there have been really wild things out there. I've seen actual in orbit tests where a CubeSat has shot a net at a target. They launched a harpoon at a target. All these different ways to clean up space. I think what we're going to be seeing is much more the Astroscale where they kind of link up with a target and drag it down or boost it into a better orbit, that kind of servicing that you'll see over time.
Well, in one tech, I remember that I don't think the flight experiment went particularly well. This is probably 4 or 5 years ago, but they shot a tether down into a lower orbit that was electrostatically charged, I think.
That was a exactly. That was a Japan aerospace exploration test, and that was
Jackson.
That was on an HTV a spacecraft that they were going to be testing that, and something happened there where they actually had to cancel that test there. It didn't go as they expected with the way that the tether and the little doodad at the end of it were supposed to work. Now, luckily they had waited to the end of that HTV mission. That's the H2 transfer vehicle. It's a robotic cargo ship that JAXA used to send to the space station to deliver supplies. So it didn't pose any problems. They were already going to burn up on the way down at that point in time. But it was, a different method that they did try at that point in time. And, we'll see. I mean, I think there's interest in a lot of different ways to clean up space because there's a lot of different satellites and different ways to get to them.
So I'm going to write JAXA as soon as we're off here and tell them that it comes officially from the editor-in-chief at space.com that their cable test terminator is correctly translated as doodad. So we'll see if they can update their historical records. All right, last up, hunting Jupiter. An interesting and kind of cool new project called the Jovian Vortex Hunter, which has kind of a real Boba Fett sound to it, doesn't it? has been launched to invite the public, and this is by NASA and the Southwest Research Institute, to invite the public to aid NASA in researching Jupiter's atmospheric dynamics. So here's your chance to be a science hero. Just access the images from the Juno-Jupiter orbiter online. There's a website for this, which we'll put up, and start your hunt after reading the instructions, of course, and you too can help NASA save money. So you put this story up, so give us some more detail.
Well, so first, just to set the background, before the Juno probe launched to Jupiter, I was very upset about it because unlike Cassini and Galileo, that have visited Jupiter in the past, where they have these super massive high-end cameras that are designed to take the best photos ever. NASA had said that there wasn't really like a big science camera for this. I mean, they had some cameras they were going to use, but they were really looking at other instruments to study Jupiter. And I was like, well, they're not even going to have great, pretty pictures of Jupiter. They're going all that way with this spacecraft. And I was floored because either I just didn't understand the citizen science aspect of this mission, or it was a full-on surprise on how well the actual cameras that they had on there are, the Juno cam. Because, normally, like the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter has so many different cameras when it looks at Mars. And Juno just has this Juno cam. And people around the world were taking the raw images from this Juno cam and tweaking it and colorizing them and just modifying them in all the different ways to pull out every little detail. And the results continue to be amazing. I mean, you can see people sharing on social media the work that they do on image processing, and it's been a massive success for NASA. So they don't have to have people process those images because the citizens are doing it, and they're following the mission. This is the next evolution of that in terms of now you're not just processing images, you're actually looking through the images to find the storms on Jupiter and flagging ones that are interesting so that scientists can go back and be like, oh yeah, we didn't know that story was there. Or yeah, I guess the great red spot is getting smaller every day, which is a true story. You should look it up. You can find it on space.com. So
I already knew that.
So, yeah, so that this seems to be like an evolution of that. And it has a kind of step-by-step instructions on how to look for these storms and identify them. And if and it looks like they even have real-time discussions of who's there right now. It says as we're talking that there's 11 people talking about it in the system right now. So it seems like it's kind of a social and a gamified way of processing, which is much different than the earlier processing I used to do as an intern at USC, because I didn't even understand how those computers worked when we were processing images of the sun. And so this is just another way to get engaged if you truly have a passion for space education, and maybe even for Jupiter too, because these images, even as raw as they are just spectacular here.
Well, that's a very smooth insertion of your prestigious alma mater, which UCLA used to refer to as the University of Spoiled Children. But I digress. So before we crawl into the mailbag,
Rod and I went to different colleges. Yes? I think we should probably point people. So.
Well, yeah, I went to a lot of them because I just couldn't get my act straight. All right, so before we dig into the fan mail, let's have a short message from our sponsors. All right, you beautiful peeps, we've gotten a pretty continuous stream of kind misses from you via email, and Tariq and I decided it was time to talk back in a public forum. So here's the cream of the crop, and we'd like you to keep those cards and letters coming because we'd like to do this on occasion. So from Steve Fentress, this was an unsolicited email, but he happens to be an old friend of mine from my Griffith Observatory days. He writes, was it appropriate to compress Apollo 17 coverage in 1972 into highlights played like halftime at a football game as opposed to teaching the audience to accept clever animations and reenactments as substitutes for reality? So there's a couple of things to unwind in here. First of all, at least as I read this, the coverage was pretty abbreviated, if you were alive then, which I know, Tariq, you weren't because you're disgustingly young.
We're talking about Apollo 17. That's 50 years ago this year, right? 1972 in December?
Yeah. You just want to remind me how old I am? Thank you.
I just want to remind the listeners about when
at least 50 plus one day. Yes. So just, for some context, when Apollo 11 landed, big day. Everything was covered minute to minute, moment to breathless moment. And we saw the whole moonwalk, and it was only a couple of hours. That was easy. And then they really tracked the mission all the way back. Apollo 12 had the misfortune of having the TV camera burn out on the moon. So we saw less of that, basically turned into a radio show, but they did put up some simulations of varying qualities. There's a story there. So people thought, well, we've already done it, right? So then Apollo 13 comes along and has the accident with the exploding oxygen tank, and the public is once again riveted to the televisions. But from Apollo 14 on, especially as they got into 15, 16, and 17, where they had the more robust lunar module that could stay on the surface longer, and the lunar rovers, where they had multiple EVAs or moonwalks, it was a lot to expect the public to watch a 7 or 8 hour moonwalk. Now, I did all of it that they televised, usually only if it was overnight. But I tell you, man, you're sitting there on Apollo 16 or 17, and you're watching two guys on live TV on the surface of the moon doing experiments in the most dangerous environment a human being's ever been in. And then they cut away to General Hospital or Days of Our Lives. And it was really quite upsetting. So if part of the question is, was that legitimate? The answer is absolutely not for me. But if you've got sponsors, and this is all over the air broadcast TV, I suppose so. Second half of the question, though, is opposed to teach the audience to accept clever animations and reenactments for substitutes for reality. I guess he means the parts of the moonwalk we didn't see. Have you ever watched those moonwalks, Tariq? Have you ever looked back at the videos?
So I've watched the old NASA, like the what is it, the transposed video, like where it's from film to digital. So I've seen all the recordings of and the clips of some of those, but of course, like not a full like 8 hour moonwalk. I haven't watched one in its entirety. I hope to, and then in the next decade.
You won't till you retire. I know you.
But I always say, I mean, of course we love space. So Rod, you and I might be a little biased, but the reason that there is NASA TV right now is so that there is 24/7 access to a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
They didn't have a NASA television channel. They had NBC and ABC and CBS, and you were done.
Yeah.
So I do kind of get that, because if you don't have a sponsor, then it's a little hard to just keep the live coverage, and then you've got to have all of the people supporting those reporters. That's the other thing that I've learned from all the years. They all need backup too. But in terms of like animations, it's hard for me to compare, because the animations that we get now are so much different than what I assume were like actual like model creations and stuff.
Sometimes it was that. Sometimes it looked. Sometimes it was that. Sometimes it looked more like paper cutouts and South Park type animation. So it just depended on the network and how prepared they were. For Apollo 12, by the way, the networks, they had setups on standby so that they could show what was going on the moon if the video failed, although I don't think any of them believed it really would. So ABC had a couple of astronauts at the Grumman Aerospace Facility up in Bethpage, New York, which is where they built the lunar module, on a lunar surface set where they did their simulations. They did. And it was fantastic. They were a little behind the curve because they're listening to Pete Conrad and Al Bean and trying to figure out what they mean. And Pete was particularly colorful in his descriptions of things. So he'd say, Al, hand me the universal tool. And so these poor guys, the TV directors go, what the hell's a universal tool? That's not on my rundown. It turns out that was his phrase for a hammer, because he solved most of his problems by hitting them with a hammer. So, but that simulation went pretty well. And ABC... Just to be clear, are these astronauts like on a mock-up lunar surface with a mock? So they have for CBS, they had a full-size lunar module mock-up on a concrete lunar surface, and they're walking around in real Apollo suits.
In spacesuits. And people wonder why people think that the moon landings were faked, right? When they have this.
Well, it wasn't very convincing, but then ABC clearly wasn't quite ready at the gate, so because I've seen these when I was working in television. We used to go down to Western Costume to rent stuff, because that was the default place in Hollywood you did this. And I remember seeing these spacesuits from the Twilight Zone that had the round fishbowl helmets that are white with a flat visor plate, and the gloves don't actually connect to the suit and all that. They're pretty awful. So ABC had a couple of those funky spacesuits. I think they were blue, if I remember correctly, in front of a backdrop that, as the guys walked around, the breeze would sort of make the backdrop wave back and forth. So that wasn't fooling anybody. But NBC really took the cake. They hired a guy who was a puppeteer to build a couple of astronaut marionettes on a little tiny plaster surface, which I guess they thought looked convincing. But if you've ever seen any of the old reruns of Thunderbirds or any of these TV shows they used to do with marionettes, so they're walking around with their arms kind of half folded up and their legs half folded up with visible strings. And then every time somebody would say, Conrad would say, okay, hand me the hammer, they'd have to cut away to a shot of the Earth over the moon or something, and then they'd cut back and there'd be a hammer taped to his hand. It was hilarious. And I spent years looking for recordings of those tapes because I wanted to put them in a couple of History Channel shows I was doing. Finally found the archivist who was responsible at NBC, and he said, we burned them. I said, you're exaggerating, right? And he said, no.
Oh my gosh.
We were so ashamed of that work. We burned them. Now, I have heard since then there might be a couple of clips floating around the archives, but I haven't seen them. But it's side splitting. All right, we don't want to get too hung up on.
I was gonna make a Capricorn 1 reference about like fake space missions, and then I realized that we didn't talk about Capricorn 1 on space movies. So,
oh, you're right. Oh, shame on me. Oh, we're gonna have to do it again now. Okay, so Jim Pittendrig, I hope I got his name right, writes, when the oxygen tank on Apollo 13 exploded and the Challenger and Columbia shuttles exploded, how did they reconstruct what happened? So I wrote him back and told him about forensics, but you probably covered it in more detail than I did.
Well, I can talk about, Columbia for sure, because that was I think that was happening as I was becoming a staff reporter for space.com. And it really is, it all comes down to telemetry and everything that you've got recording for these missions, because what NASA did, they were able to find, the black box for the flight recorder for Columbia. Right. Luckily, when sadly it had broken apart over Texas, there was a very wide debris field. So they were able to recover many fragments of the orbiter itself. Sadly, also some human remains too from the crew members that were tragically lost. And by analyzing the recorder, like what it registered of the way down, and comparing that with the imagery that the chase planes were able to get, they had some infrared imagery where you can see debris trailing, not debris, but maybe like a heat wake coming from the wing, the left wing that had been punctured from the foam that had struck it. And they used a lot of that telemetry to rebuild the actual wing of Columbia with this reinforced carbon. I should probably start to say on February 1st, 2003, Columbia was lost on the way back to Earth during reentry because of heat shield damage on its left wing sustained at launch, where a piece of foam, frozen foam, smashed through it, kind of like a baseball through the front window. And so this is how they were able to investigate that. They had a whole crack team of engineers, independent team, I should point out, that was doing a lot of that. And then NASA took that data, built the actual heat shield to prove that what they thought that couldn't happen, that this carbon could be punctured by foam. In fact, it did. It was a real shocking demonstration, according to Leonard David, who was covering that. He was there for those tests for Space.com. Had told me that they were all shocked when they shot this foam through the carbon.
Just to illustrate it, this is the left wing, correct?
Yes, it was the left wing leading edge.
And the front leading edge of that is basically carbon composite extruded into a curve. So it's essentially a plastic shell, if you will. And so they fired these chunks of foam out of I think it was an air gun. Yeah. And man, it went through it like it was going through a paper cup. It was shocking. It really was.
And you saw a lot of those types of investigations during Challenger and Apollo 13. Apollo 13 in particular. And I should point out also, Apollo 1 had this similar investigation, and that was a fatal accident on the pad that killed three astronauts. And so each time they go deep into the records of those vehicles, what was changed, what was the final state of it, and they've recorded. Now it's all digital, so that's maybe a little easier for them to track. But there's like how many miles of wiring alone, let alone plumbing and cooling and all of that stuff that they have to account for. And in the Apollo 1 investigation alone, they took apart other capsules on the ground to look for flaws, and they found a lot. In fact, they found tools, I think, in the walls, that were left over. Yeah, is one of the stories that I had come across.
Washers or something. Yeah, and they were able to discover that access hatch inside was rubbing against the wire, the way the wire was positioned, and scraping off the insulation was probably made this short. It is worth mentioning that from the very beginning, NASA spacecraft send back what you called telemetry earlier, which is a digital signal that tells you the state of the spacecraft for whatever is being monitored by sensors. So for all those accidents, we had telemetry, at least up to the point of the accident in the case of Columbia and Challenger, that was downloaded. So you've got a recording of the systems that are being monitored, which it didn't have with Apollo 13, was remains. So with both shuttles, you had fragments, and with Apollo 1, of course, you had the burnt spacecraft. But with Apollo 13, all that happened out in space, and we didn't get any part of the lunar module back, and all we got back from the command module was the capsule itself, not the service module, which is the cylindrical rocket booster and life support unit behind it. So all that had to be done kind of by inductive reasoning. You had to think, okay, if this, then that. And what they found on Apollo 13 finally was that the oxygen tank that exploded had been dropped at one point, not very far, maybe 15 inches, but enough that it could have been a problem, and that a switch or thermostat inside had been cooked by applying too much voltage. They were trying to boil off some of the fuel in it at one point when it was on a test stand. And I think they erroneously put in 60 volts instead of the 24 that it was rated at, and fused part of the switch. And then that, of course, in flight overheated, and there was a spark and kaboom. So that was tough. I mean, that's like guessing from a distance, but they did it. And it's impressive if you go back and look at the pictures from Apollo 1 and Challenger, Columbia, when you see the hangars where they spread out all these pieces, everything's labeled. There's people walking around looking and checking. And in fact, it's a very sobering experience. But if you go to the Kennedy Space Center, you can see a big fragment of, I think it's Challenger, right? Or is it Columbia? That they've got mounted on the wall there in kind of a shadow box.
It is one of them. I haven't been down there recently, so I wouldn't be able to comment. I mean, they do a really nice job at Kennedy Space Center of chronicling kind of the whole program overall. So in terms of like with showing shuttle, they've got a new museum there that just opened too about deep space exploration, which will be exciting to see too. But this challenge of understanding what's going on, especially in an emergency, because we've seen them on other spacecraft. There was the fire, of course, on Mir. There was during my tenure a computer failure on the International Space Station in like the master control of the Russian segment, which controls like the bulk of that segment. And that was a real dire situation trying to figure things out. Yeah. And it took them a while to come up with a workaround to get around these failed computers, and then later to get like a new brain sent up to the station to get that part of it fixed. I think it got up to like 90 degrees inside the space station for a while. Something really crazy, that was really uncomfortable. And so those challenges do happen. I mean, nothing on the scale of the fatal accidents that we've seen, thankfully, but they've learned how to record that telemetry in real time, save it for later, and make sure that they've got a good, robust investigation. The investigation starts as soon as they detect a problem. So for Columbia, there's an historic clip of Leroy Kane, where he said he's the flight director on duty during that reentry, and he says lock the doors. Where that they got to stop. Yeah. They got to stop and just make sure that they're recording everything, and that everyone knows who is doing what at what time, so they can start their analysis going forward from there.
Yeah, and watching that shot of his face when he realizes what's happened is heartbreaking, because you can just kind of see it crawling over his face. The flight director.
There's a really good book by Bill Harwood and Mike Cabbage called Comcheck about that moment and that accident for Columbia, and it is riveting when you read their final reenactment after their lengthy investigation about what exactly happened during that accident, and it is all built on this investigation, on the stories and recordings of the engineers who were tracking all of the telemetry, all of the findings, all of the investigations in real time to understand what had happened during that. And one of the big flags for Bill and Mike in understanding what was going on is there is a scene where where you watch the shuttle land, there's a little line going across the country. That's where the shuttle is, that NASA's tracking. And the landing time comes and goes, and the line had stopped basically over Texas. And that was the big moment of revelation for folks who were not in mission control, to know that there was something wrong, because it was supposed to have landed by now, and yet this is saying that it's still over Texas. So,
okay, well, let's move on to something a little more cheerful here. We got a really juicy question for the next one, and we're going to come to that right after this short break. All right, this one's from Norm Fazekas, who is on the Discord for Club TWiT. So he's a member of Club TWiT, which you can join too and get all your podcasts ad-free. And we're on Discord quite a bit, so it's a good place to hang out and ask questions or make comments or shake your fist at me or whatever you want to do. So he says, hey, Rod, I saw your post to Discord and thought I'd ask you guys to theorize a bit on a comment from last week's show. You mentioned what could have been if Apollo had kept on. Oh, man. What would have been involved? More missions to the moon? Would we be on Mars already? Outposts on the moon or Mars? Would it be like For All Mankind? I hope not, because there's some of that's just way too boring for words. What would we have lost and gained?
You really don't like the drama.
There's just too much soap opera. Yeah. But that's not his question. Would we still be disposing of boosters, or would NASA have discovered the flyback method to save their budget? So on and so on. What about the international folks? There's a lot more pieces of this, but I think we should just concentrate on the what if about Apollo. So from roughly 1961 to 1975, we flew the Saturn V and the Apollo spacecraft, which was designed to get astronauts to the moon as quickly as possible. It was just enough to do the job, but it was also extremely capable and well-vetted hardware. And people looking back from the 23rd century, when we're living out by Jupiter or whatever, look back and see that we developed this incredible hardware and all this potential, and then just stopped because President Nixon and to some extent the administration before him said, okay, this isn't our top priority, we got to move on. It's kind of jaw-dropping. Getting back to those clickbait headlines we were talking about the other day, it's kind of stunning that would happen. And you wouldn't think that anybody would do that unless they were strapped or, the country was coming apart at the seams. And although 1968 was a rough year, America was stable. So, we don't need to get into why that was the case. But I think, what we see on For All Mankind, with some exceptions, I mean, it starts with the Russians getting the moon first, which was not the case. But the idea of that program continuing up through Apollo 20, 25, 30, and the building of a small moon base and more sophisticated pressurized rovers and stuff, which is all this was planned by the Apollo Applications Program, which was intended to extend the use of that hardware if the money kept coming in. I see no reason that you couldn't have not only continued to put habitations and research teams on the moon, but as we see in All Mankind, you could launch from the much lower gravity well of the moon much easier to get to Mars if you built a spacecraft up there, especially if they continued with, which isn't mentioned here, but if they continued with developing the Nerva atomic engine, which would get you to Mars quite a bit faster, you could still use some parts of the Apollo hardware to do that, both launching the parts and you could use a reinforced command module with a stronger heat shield for reentry. It's a lot hotter than coming back from the moon, but it'd still work. So yeah, I think we would have continued that. I think we would have also launched military missions from Vandenberg, possibly using Apollo hardware. And
get that space shuttle launching out of Vandenberg, right?
Yeah, because I mean, they rebuilt Slick 6 to do that and just never got around to it. Although there's some question as to whether it would have actually survived or not the way it was designed. And in fact, von Braun and his team had worked up plans for a flyback first stage of the Saturn V. So all this stuff was being discussed. These are smart people. We flew a lot of cool missions in the file cabinets, but unfortunately, most of that stuff didn't make it to reality. And the final use of the Saturn V was for Skylab, and the final use of the Apollo hardware. Skylab was 73. Final use of the Apollo hardware was for the not quite as impressive Apollo-Soyuz project, or as the Soviets would call it, the Soyuz-Apollo project, to have an Apollo spacecraft and a Soyuz spacecraft link up in orbit and have the infamous handshake in space between the Americans and the Soviets.
I think it's all about momentum, though, right, Rod? I mean, it's not just about momentum, is what I was going to say, because, you know, as you mentioned, the money had to be there, and it was there for Apollo to get there. But it, you know, that wasn't really the way that I think von Braun had imagined sending people to space. He wanted a fully reusable, space planes, a big space station.
He had shuttles, he had a space station, he had a whole infrastructure worked up, which is kind of what we're aiming for now, ironically.
Yeah. And so I think what we're seeing now is kind of a reinvention of the path that could have been from that space race, where they did just stop. And they stopped because they just didn't want to spend the money, the powers that be.
And let's not forget Vietnam. Rockets. I mean, we had a lot of expensive adventures going on in Southeast Asia that were kind of idiotic. And
you had mentioned, 1968 to the 70s, there were other things that were going on, and the whole challenge of getting to the moon before the Soviets had been achieved. And so, we were talking about Apollo 17 earlier and how it got kind of shunted down to flight day highlights, which is what we see now, right? Now we get an update a week from the astronauts on the space station, but they can also tweet, their photos and stuff in real time, which keeps people really interested. And I think what we're seeing now is a reinvention of that whole process, where you have companies now that are launching people into space, but then they're launching people into space and they're landing rockets again, something that NASA did with the space shuttle. Now they're launching people to the space station for the first time on their own. They've got plans for their own space planes that are going to be reusable, and they're building their own personal habitats. They've got plans to go to the Mars with SpaceX and their lander, and whoever wins the final second contract for the moon lander there too. So I think the sustainability is the key. I would have loved to have seen a Sea Dragon launch, and we saw that in For All Mankind. Tell
us what that is, because that was impressive.
So a Sea Dragon was like a supply rocket that NASA had envisioned as part of the future of its program. It was so massive they would take it out to the ocean, and then like half of it would be under the actual water line.
Just floating by itself. There's no launch pad.
It would float. There's no tower. There's no launch pad. It floats there, and then it just launches out of the ocean because it's so massive. It needs that support of the ocean to be able to hold it up, and then it sheds the stages as it gets there. And For All Mankind, in the first two seasons, mostly in season 2, that is their go-to supply rocket to get things to their moon base. But NASA had wanted to use it had envisioned using it to get really big things into orbit. I've seen crazy designs that have been pulled from the archives. There's a YouTuber that people might want to check out called Hazy Gray Art. And I don't know who they are, but they make the most high-fidelity concepts of what could have been. There was one where they had clustered 5 Saturn Vs together to create a massive mega rocket to get like a 1 million pound payload into space,
Right.
And it's just like, wow, that's just amazing that we could have done that stuff. If the push had been there, if the competitiveness, which might be there now with all of these companies, with China, and what we're seeing with the split with Russia from the scientific community, we could see that again, where people are going to want different ways to get to space so that we don't get stuck anywhere, different ways to get to the moon, different ways to get to Mars. China says they're going to return the first Mars samples back before NASA and anyone else.
At the rate we're going, I wouldn't be surprised if they did.
That's the kind of impetus that Norm, what drives many different ways to go forward. So, it's if we hadn't stopped, we could be a lot farther on. I think that's true. Would we be where we are now with lots of reusable rockets? SpaceX just landed their 100th, flew a reusable rocket and landed it for the 100th time. I don't know if we'd be actually at there because there might have been a different way of
wait
getting,
a minute.
So
13th time. They've flown the 100th mission, but they haven't flown the 100th mission individual booster. Yeah.
No, they haven't flown a booster for 100 times. No, what I was saying is they've
not yet.
Overall, they've reused rockets. 100 times of all their missions. So they've done
and what the recent launch where they had that trifecta over the weekend last week. I think that was the 13th flight of one of them, right?
It was the 13th flight of rocket, most flown. Yep,
and that's impressive considering how recently we were still throwing them away. By the way, for anybody who's interested in kind of this alternative stuff, and I'd have to look up. Maybe I'll mention next week. I have to look up who the source was, but there was a guy in Australia who probably 8 years ago started, he was a visual effects professional, started doing these wonderful visual effects sequences along with interviews with fictitious astronauts and so forth of Wernher von Braun's designs from the 50s. So the orbital shuttle that used some kind of, it was an acid and and hydrazine. It was some really horrible caustic fuel. The inflatable space station in orbit that von Braun had designed and all this stuff. And it's all done in beautiful, it looks real. This isn't like Thunderbirds Ago. This is a background plate of the Kennedy Space Center from across the Banana River. And he composites the von Braun orbital shuttle over the pad, and you see it lift off, and people are cheering and jumping up and down, and then you see it reaching orbit, and the top stage leaving and off to Mars. And he even has a wonderful sequence, if you've ever looked at or read the Mars Project, von Braun's book from the early 50s, he has a wonderful sequence of those gliders landing on Mars. Now, we know they wouldn't have done that. They would have augured in because the atmosphere was so much thinner than we thought. But it's really impressive. And the coolest part is the astronauts are wearing helmets, look kind of like gussied up motorcycle helmets, but they're plated with gold. It's a very cool thing. Maybe I'll post a clip of it at some point. All right, let's get on to, here's a note from Ken. I'm sorry, Ken, I don't have your last name. Says, love the show. Something about that big starship that keeps coming to mind. If they send a few of these to the moon or Mars, they won't be bringing all that gear back. Why don't they repurpose the fuel tank and use it as a house? Come to think of it, could they do that in orbit too? Half dozen launches, it's a space station. Just a nerdy nerd with no degrees, Ken. Well, Ken, science degrees aren't necessary for admission, so you are welcome company here. This was actually considered with the shuttle for external fuel tanks. They had talked about using those for space stations, didn't, unfortunately. Starship isn't a fuel. It's not an external tank. It's a complete spacecraft.
It's not as modular. Yeah, this is really interesting because Starship is it's like a giant rocket, and if you empty it out, there's a lot of space in there.
Yes,
but what SpaceX wants to do is not build very many starships compared to how many missions they want to fly, similar to what they're doing with Falcon 9 now, and they just want to reuse them over and over again. And unlike the shuttle, Ken, Starship is it's the entire vehicle is self-enclosed, and the astronauts basically will right in the top, obviously, there'll be a big cargo hold, big enough to hold, a truck for the moon, according to what we've seen from SpaceX's animations. Yeah. And they will have a crane/elevator that will get them down from the crew capsule part, because it's going to land vertically on the moon. The goal is not to leave it there once they unpack everything, because they're going to want to use it to lift off again. And what they might be leaving in space is whichever vehicle is the dedicated lander will just kind of make trips either between Leo to get refueled or the Gateway to get refueled once it gets out there. And it'll just be that shuttle taxi going back and forth and back and forth. That's what they want to use it for. If they're ever going to mothball one, that we could see a potential where they would take the habitable volume and strip that down, and then maybe recover the engines for another vehicle. That's really far down and assumes a lot of in-space construction and deconstruction that we haven't proved out yet. The big thing that SpaceX is hoping to do with these vehicles is in-space refueling. They're going to demonstrate that with NASA, and once they can lick that, then I think we can think about future how end of life uses for these vehicles. I think 9 times out of 10, they would most likely want to strip it for parts before convert it into something else, unless they have a trillionaire who wants one for his personal getaway in space. That's possible. That's what we're seeing now. People are buying up full flights on Starship and whatnot to go around the moon. So we're seeing a lot of interest there. So, but in terms of reusing it to make a space station like those plans for the external tank, I don't think that's in the cards right now. It would be interesting to see if they do that, or NASA wants to opt to look into that for SLS in the future with those big stages that they leave up there. But then I know it adds. Rod is laughing because
the throwaway rocket.
SLS. Yeah. So
apologies to your sister.
So I'm not digging it. I'm just saying that there's more complexity now, because unlike with the space shuttle where the whole tank is contained and they jettison the whole tank and then it's just up there for a little bit, where you might want a crew to go and grab it. Those stages are actively being thrown out much faster during an SLS launch, so it'd be a little bit more difficult to get them.
And you did mention returning to Leo, just so it's clear, that's low Earth orbit, not Leo Laporte. So
that's right.
We're not flying rockets to Leo's house in Petaluma.
Although I hear Leo's great, so.
He is, and he'd probably enjoy having a Starship land in his backyard, but we'll have to ask his permission first. Here's one from Jim Reed. Just finished with Twist 10. A lot of fun discussion. A few movies he needs to add to his list because he hasn't seen them yet. Also, he doesn't feel bad about skipping First Man. Well, it's worth watching, just with a grain of salt. He said, I thought of a movie. This is funny. I thought of a movie that didn't make your list, but it might be because it was a TV movie. For people who are not old enough to remember, TV movies were movies made for broadcast television, usually on 16 millimeter film, usually pretty poorly budgeted with awful props and special effects and burned in yellow titles. They were pretty desperate. So this one, which I never saw, was called Stowaway to the Moon. He says it's one that he painfully remembers from his youth. Quote, little LJ is able to sneak onto KSC, Kennedy Space Center, and hitch a ride on the Camelot module of an Apollo flight to the moon. Wow, where would he hide? And saves the day by helping an ill command module pilot while the other astronauts are on the moon. Wikipedia lists it as starring Pete Conrad among the rest of the crowd. So I do remember that Conrad, among the Apollo cadre of astronauts, kind of dug doing these little guest appearances. I'm guessing he didn't read the script because, on a command module, there's nowhere to stow away. There's a little bit of room under the couches, but they'd hear you breathing because they're only about 2 feet above you. So that's pretty funny. I assume you've never seen this, right?
I've never seen it, but the funny thing is there's a new Netflix movie that just came out recently called Apollo 10.5, where they built the Apollo 11 module, but they accidentally scaled it down. But they have to fly it anyway, and so they send a kid there instead. And so, but this sounds like my kind of bag. There's a lot of like kid shows out there, kid movies out there that I would totally watch. There was one where like a really crazy comedian launched to the moon. He's like a real goofy guy, and they connected his air with his commander, and there's a lot of fart jokes in between, So there's a lot of other stuff that we didn't talk about. Well,
and I realized there's one I forgot, which was Iron Sky. Did you see that?
Iron Sky. They made a sequel to that movie as well.
Yes,
it's on.
And I know the writer, the original writer. I had hired him back in my Disney days, and I wrote him after I saw the first one, and I said, Mike, what happened? And he said, it's not my fault. I wrote a good script. They came in and changed it, and Iron Sky is like 5 movies mashed into one. And astronauts land on the moon. And there's all these kind of ethnicity jokes because one of them's black, which is kind of inappropriate. The jokes are, and then they're walking around the moon. And suddenly, these guys in Nazi trench coats and helmets with gas masks on pop up from behind a rock, and they kill one astronaut, capture the other. And they drive back to their base, which is on the far side of the moon and shaped like a giant swastika. And they have flying saucers they're building to reinvade the Earth. And they come back to Earth. And then we find out that President Sarah Palin, don't mention her by name, but she's lookalike and acts like Sarah Palin, has an army of starships and airships to take on the German flying saucers as they approach Earth. And it just goes on and on. And it's funny and it's entertaining, but it's almost unwatchable if you follow my drift.
It is entertaining. I did watch it, and I remember thinking it was just hilariously. But like to me, that's a movie that was so bad it was good, right?
Yeah.
And the whole plot is that during World War II, the Nazis built a base on the moon so that they could basically preserve their military so they can come back later.
Yeah.
And I guess it did well enough to make a sequel, Rod, because they did, right? So there. By the way, there is there is also an old TV miniseries about James Michener's space, which I would really like to see. I think it has the original Maverick from that TV show that he's the cowboy James
Garner.
Is that as the commander and I
so this was
never
a
seen it.
miniseries,
is a miniseries
made
based
from
on
a
the
book that was, and the book was like, you could stack furniture on it. It was something like 900 pages, right? It's huge.
Yeah, I've got 2 copies of it.
Oh, your inner geek is showing. I think we got time for one more question, so I'm going to save the rest of these for later. This is from Jamie. Hi, guys. The show is great. You do an amazing job of covering, just reading this because it feels good, do an amazing job of covering current space news and interesting stuff in the past. One part of space travel that doesn't get much press, though, is food. We had endless Tang commercials in the 60s and 70s, but now nothing. Well, that was the space age for you. I would love to hear your views on what astronauts will eat while they explore caves on the moon. Are there any commercial food companies involved in producing this food? Where will it come from? Those little hydroponic gardens in the ISS are cute, but will they ever feed a crew? So he's talking about these growth experiments that they're doing, not in soil. I think they're using aerogel or something to hold the moisture up against the plants in these racks on the International Space Station. And they've grown some various lettuce-type greens. And it's great. They pick them and they eat them. It's like, hey, look, we can grow lettuce. But yeah, it's enough to support them for about one lunch. So,
but Jamie is right. Where you had Tang, which to my knowledge, I'm not sure they actually ever drank Tang in space. If you can correct me if I'm wrong.
I think they did actually, but it wasn't invented for the space program. It had been around for years. Yeah,
and I think that's the myth, right? That associates with Tang. The really interesting thing is that astronauts are not allowed to actually advertise, like to make commercials. In fact, NASA's not allowed to advertise. That's why you don't see a Join NASA a commercial on television to join the astronaut corps because they're not allowed to in their charter.
Well, and they don't need to, right?
They don't.
They got 100,000 applications.
There was a fear that if NASA could advertise like that on radio and magazine, join us now, join the mission, that the military forces and other parts of the government, no one would want to join them. They'd all want to go to NASA, which, you might be true because you can see what's happening with the Space Force right now. And, but so the astronauts themselves can't make a commercial for stuff. Now we have seen like Coca-Cola and Pepsi fly in space where they do experiments and it has their brand logo on it, but it's always kind of guys like that. And more recently, Jamie, they made cookies. They made DoubleTree, whatever those DoubleTree Hotel
chocolate chip cookies are. Yeah. And they're good.
They had a new oven that they teamed up with a company, and I'm sorry that the name escapes me right now. To
Easy
make
Bake,
these
perhaps? Just kidding.
Yeah, it's similar to that to make these zero-G cookies. That's what we're seeing now. We're not seeing commercials though because they're not allowed to advertise. However, in other space agencies, they are. Sergei Krikalev, the veteran and hailed cosmonaut with Russia, has recorded a few commercials for ramen and whatnot, where you can actually look online and find the video of him eating a ramen noodle cup on the International Space Station, things like that, or on Mir. And so there are commercials like that. But when they do go, it's mostly going to be a lot of these amalgamations of these private companies and what they've been building to make these new ovens and these new ways to keep food warm and keep it fresh. There's a like a minus 80-degree freezer that NASA has built that they will go to the store before a cargo launch to the space station or a SpaceX launch that has astronauts, and they'll fill it with some ice cream, and they'll be able to get ice cream from the I think it's Blue
and
Ribbon
not
is what they said.
That horrible astronaut ice cream, space ice cream that they sell at the Kennedy Space Center. That's basically a piece of chalk that would clog up the air filters.
No, this is actual
real
ice cream. You know, it's like Blue Ribbon or whatever. I forget what the name is. I remember they sent soft cheese on a. It's like the cow brand. Do you remember? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, Elsie or Bluebell or something. Yeah.
Yeah, Bluebell. It's like that you can unwrap. They sent a whole bunch of that to the space station for the first time a year or two ago on a new refrigerator that they built for the Northrop Grumman Antares Cygnus cargo delivery system. And that was like a big thing because they had an astronaut that just liked that kind of cheese, but you can't get it on the space station because it goes bad a lot faster. But now they've got this new refrigerator that keeps it fresh. And I was really excited about that cheese story, more so than maybe I should have been.
You're a little weird, Tariq.
It's a lot of fun.
I don't even like that cheese. Let me just add a couple things for Jamie to wrap it up. There is a fairly large food kitchen and experimental center at Johnson Space Center. That's right. And the name of the woman who runs it escapes me, but they work with executive chefs and chemists and food labs all over the country, and they try to come up with interesting, very flavorful meals, often with more salt than you'd probably normally like, and a lot of spices, because astronauts in zero G, as we've talked about before, the fluids in their bodies redistribute. They tend to get kind of almost a permanent head cold syndrome, and it's hard to taste things. So they work a lot on making them very flavorful. They can last for a long time. They're kind of like really high-end MREs, meals ready to eat, like the military has without the little heater element. And supposedly they're pretty good, but it is an ongoing area of research. And when you're talking about going to Mars with a one-way trek of 5 to 7 months, you're going to need a lot of this. There have been other, I wouldn't say it's an active experiment, but there's been papers written about things like, for just basic nutrition, growing algae in a water jacket around the spacecraft, which would also help to mediate radiation, and then cultivating the algae and making it into an edible protein. Now, if anybody who's ever had a protein shake at the gym knows that it's hard to make that stuff taste like you want it to. So I'm not sure how you'd process the algae to make it palatable. I think that's part of what they're looking at. But there are various things that they are exploring for food that's fresh and nutritious and not just packaged. But I think for the most part, it's probably going to come from places like the JSC lab and ultimately private contracts. Boy, there's so much stuff here, but we're going to have to hold off on the rest. One person.
I will just because we're talking about space food, I will point out that my cat ate my 12-year-old Japanese space food sampler. It was like freeze dried chicken that I had for a decade, and my cat ate it last year. So he didn't die, but man, I didn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. It was just sitting on a shelf. So it does last. I can guarantee, and apparently you can eat it after that at that period of time.
You lead a full and exciting life, my friend. I'll just add as a coda, and we could talk about it another day. But Doug Ferguson did write and mention one movie that we didn't include. I thought we did, but that he says we didn't include. Wait a minute. No, I'm sorry. He was commenting on Space Camp. He says they didn't even get the site right. Space Camp was in Alabama, not KSC, where they shot the movie. And I don't think they ever test fired the engines of the shuttle, right? Well, they did, but certainly not the way it was represented in that movie. And what was it? The solids on one side ignited, and
so they had to ignite the other
came
side.
loose, and they had to release the other. Yeah, they had to release both. What a horrible, god awful movie. All right, well, we'll continue this in the future, but this has been fun, and please keep those cards and letters coming because we enjoy the feedback an awful lot. This has been a grand stroll through the intelligent and inquisitive minds of our loyal fans. Be sure to send your thoughts to us at twis@twit.tv. That's twis@twit.tv. We answer every single email, and we're almost always nice. Of course, Tariq is always kind, but I'm working on bringing him down to my level. So I want to thank everybody for being here today. You can send us feedback, as I said, at twis@twit.tv. New episodes published every Friday on your favorite podcatcher. So that's Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and all those other ones that you subscribe to listen to various things. So make sure to subscribe, tell your friends, and give us a big thumbs up or 5 stars or whatever it is they're asking for. You can follow the TWiT Tech Podcast Network at TWiT on Twitter and on Facebook, and twit.tv on Instagram. And you can always head over to our website at twit.tv/TWIS. We will see you next time.
Listeners of this program get an ad-free version if they're members of Club TWiT. $7 a month gives you ad-free versions of all of our shows, plus membership in the Club TWiT Discord, a great clubhouse for TWiT listeners. And finally, the TWiT Plus feed, with shows like Stacy's Book Club, The Untitled Linux Show, The Giz Fizz, and more. Go to twit.tv/clubtwit, and thanks for your support.